Well, welcome to today's webinar on nutrient management recommendations for wheat. I'm Jeff Gilder, one of the agronomists with the Andersons, along with Jessica Link. We're your agronomy team with the Andersons plant specialty products. We're going to touch base on some considerations for NPK on wheat, along with some micronutrient considerations in terms of timing of nutrients, go over our high yield programs, and then we're going to kind of touch base on what to look for in terms of soybean disease management and insect management as we start to progress into our reproductive stages of wheat or of soybeans. In terms of wheat, we know that as you go across the U.S., wheat is one of those really diverse crops, whether it's spring planted or fall planted, red wheat, white wheat, whether it's hard or soft. But as we go through this today, kind of keep in mind that our growth stages and our timings for application are going to be similar no matter what class of wheat you are planting. When we take a look at the application side of it, kind of no matter how you get to that application or what you're looking at, we want to make sure that we're placing those products in a timely manner. And Jessica and I are kind of really going to focus today on our high yield part, which will focus on our pure grade starters, our pure grade foliars, and our micronutrient packages. So when we take a look at our high yield program, this is really our opportunity to look at the total season package. And we always kind of stress that part of making sure that that high yield program is part of your written plan. We've talked about a written plan in the past, really laying out all the steps that you're going to need to take during that growing season. That's going to include your nutrient management plans, your fertility, your insect control, your disease management, and as we look at all those different growth stages, having something in place in that written plan that you can go back and take a look at with your growers. And so why do we always kind of stress that high yield? But particularly when we talk about wheat, we want to talk about making sure on that pre-plant side that we're talking about having a balanced pH, great opportunity to add some of our humates in that pre-plant timing. And then when we talk about planting or really that stand establishment, this is really that point in time where we really want to make sure that we're developing roots underneath that plant. This is where our water and nutrient movement is going to happen during the course of the growing season. We really want to establish a really good root system underneath that plant. And then on the tillering side, this is really where we're going to influence our grain formation, the number of spikes that we have in that plant, and really this is where we're going to determine our yield side, early in the growing seasons during that tillering point in time. Stem elongation, this is really how we establish some plant health, as we move towards that flag leaf, as we move towards heading, in terms of that stem strength, this is really the standability part, making sure that we have a good healthy crop before we get to harvest. And then as we start to look at those heading sides, whether we're making a fungicide application or some slow release nitrogen at that plant time, it's really about plant health before pollination and plant health before we hit grain fill.
Thank you, Jeff. So we talked already about the high yield program. This is the one for wheat, but I just wanted to show it one more time in this beginning part of the presentation, just to really share that our program is encompassing the entire growing season, starting pre-emergent, pre-plant, all the way through heading and harvest, to make sure that we really meet the nutrient needs of that wheat crop throughout the season. When we look at our products, our recommendations encompass all the nutrients that are required through the growing season. So looking at it nutrient by nutrient and how our program fits in. Firstly, we have nitrogen, and a couple points I want to hit on the nitrogen. We won't talk about every single bullet point on this slide, but pull out the most important ones. Firstly, nitrogen is very important for our chlorophyll production and photosynthesis, so helping that plant create the energy that it needs to go throughout the growing season. If you don't have enough nitrogen, it looks like chlorosis on the lower leaves, and that's because that nitrogen is mobile within the plant, so it will take the nitrogen from those lower leaves and move it up to the top where it's mostly required. And you will mostly find our nitrogen deficiency in cold, wet conditions. I understand that's not something we're experiencing at the moment, but that is a challenge as we head into, overwintering and making sure that nitrogen is where it needs to be. When it comes to phosphorus, a couple of things that we want to look at here is in promoting our seedling and root development. That's going to be very important for that crop to establish early in the season to help reduce our winter kill, which is denoted in the next part with the poor root growth and seed growth. If you don't have enough phosphorus, you really aren't going to have that root structure to help it overwinter. You also have stunting of growth, poor tillering, and decreased number of heads. Jeff had talked a bit about the tillering and how important that is heading into grain production and our overall plant health. So if we can impact our number of tillers, we're going to have a very big impact on our yield at harvest. What impacts our phosphorus is going to be higher soil pH and, again, cold temperatures. So next we have potassium. When it comes to potassium, we have our disease tolerance and winter hardiness. When it comes to wheat, obviously winter hardiness is very, very important because we are having that wheat overwinter in a lot of very cold climates. So if we can, make that overwinter better, we're going to be in a much better position. When it comes to deficiencies, we're going to experience some slow growth, weaker stalks, and shriveled seeds. And when it comes to factors of deficiency, if you experience drought or soil saturation, too much magnesium or sodium, or soil compaction, you are going to have a decreased availability of potassium. So that covers our NPK, our macronutrients, and then heading into our secondary macronutrients and our micronutrients, we have sulfur. So sulfur is incredibly important, again, for chlorophyll formation. This works hand in hand with nitrogen and impacts our nitrogen use efficiency. And that's why a lot of our symptoms are going to be very similar visually. You have that chlorosis, however, it's going to be on our upper leaves and in our new growth compared to our old leaves. Deficiency of this will usually appear in the spring. And why do we experience these deficiencies? Well, we aren't getting it free from the air anymore because our air is cleaned up, which is really great for our lungs, but not so great for our crops. So we aren't getting that sulfur from rainfall, meaning we have to supplement it into our growing systems.
Good. Thank you, Jessica. Jessica touched on the NPK side of it. I'm going to quickly touch base and give you some highlights on the micronutrient side and having, and the importance of having them being part of your plan. So when we think about wheat, the first one that usually comes to mind for me is going to be on the copper side, and the value of copper really is going to be in the enzyme activation, and a lot of things happen with that enzyme activation as we go through the growing season. Usually what you're going to see is going to be stunted plants, or sometimes you'll see some twisted leaves, especially up at the top. Soils with a really high pH to them, something that's been recently limed, as going to be the fields that we're probably going to see it in the most, along with those sandy soils with some really low CECs. Boron, similar to corn, we want to talk about the pollination side and how important that is. And usually what you're going to see out there in terms of deficiency is really poor pollination, poor flowering. That's going to happen, and really that factor, that we want to consider is really the need to have boron be part of your nutrient plan throughout the whole growing season. So we don't have that deficiency and we're not putting on too much at a time to have that toxicity side of it. Iron, we really want to talk about that chlorophyll formation, the active respiration. This is where we're really getting our nice deep dark green color from. And one of the things that we'll tend to see on iron, is really that bleaching side of it, that intervenal chlorosis that we'll see out there when we have those deficiencies. But iron, especially in a grass crop, is where we're really going to see that nice color in that plant from. And then zinc and manganese, usually the things that we talk about when we talk about corn and we talk about soybeans. But really the factors here in terms of zinc and manganese are really going to come into play. Zinc, really building that nice root growth underneath there. Manganese being that multitasker. So we're talking about flowering and pollination, nitrogen metabolism. some enzyme activation that's going to happen out there, and just like corn and soybeans, it's really those cooler, wetter conditions as we're going to see these things pop up. And then as we kind of look back at our high yield programs, those yield determining timings, in terms of our tillering, but as we move closer to heading and we get into that flag leaf side, and then we get into the heading, where we look at a 10.1, maybe a 10.5, it's really all about plant health and protecting that plant to making sure that we're maximizing the yield side of it. So great opportunity when we hit those fungicide timings to add a foliar fertilizer in, especially like a slow release nitrogen, one of our overpass products. Really the opportunity here to help fill out those heads, talk about dry down and helping with dry down, and really having that plant mature out as opposed to dying early.
So now that we've talked about all of the nutrients and how they play into a full nutrition program, we want to talk about our high yield program and how well it performs in the field. So we have our good, better, and best program. Good includes our BioReverse and Ultramate, and then we add in more products as we get to the better and the best program, and looking at how well those yielded in an actual year. So here we have our straw yield. This was our first metric that we took compared to the check. So our good, better, and best, you can see a nice, beautiful stair-step approach, getting more straw, a more robust, a lot more healthier plant overall when we have add a few more of those products to meet those nutrient needs of the crop. Then when it comes to tillers, like Jeff had said, tillers are a very good indicator of our overall crop health. When you have more tillers, you have more spikes, more places to have grain formation, and again, more straw. So we're going to have a healthier, higher yielding crop with more tillers per acre. You can see, again, a beautiful stair step where we have added more of those products in to meet the nutrient needs. And then finally, we have yield, which is the ultimate important thing when it comes to how well a program performs. And you can see that we did see a pretty significant increase in yield with the good, better, and the best program at harvest. And this trial was done up in Wisconsin. So they did face some pretty cold temperatures, so winter kill was a factor, but overall everything yielded pretty great. And now we are going to switch gears and talk about foliar diseases.
Well, good. Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, so as we kind of move into the reproductive growth stages of our soybeans, we want to touch base on 3 diseases and kind of what to be looking for out there when you're walking your fields, and start to do some monitoring as you're looking at some weather patterns. As we move into those reproductive stages, this is really where our yield determining timings are going to be on those beans. That R1 with that first flower, R3, we're starting to look at that first pod. Great opportunities to add in some foliar fertilizers at these times. So the first one is going to be white mold. Kind of one of them ones that's, kind of easy to identify out there as you start to see that white fluffy growth on the soybean stems. As you're looking at the soil surface, this is usually where you're going to start to see those mushroom-like structures out into the plants. Something that usually is going to happen during our flowering time frame. Here, we really want to look for those wetter conditions, that higher humidity, that higher moisture that's going to be out there. This is when this disease is going to affect that plant. And then as we start to look at kind of the management side of it, crop rotation is going to be huge on this list. Watching those weather patterns that are out there, planning ahead. When you start to think about those fungicides out there, and probably the key on the fungicide out here is that we're really looking at a protective scenario and not a curative. There's really nothing that we can do on the curative side once this plant is affected. So as we start to move into those reproductive stages, we start to look at some higher moisture out there, start to look for some white mold, and be prepared for it. Septoria brown rot. This is a plant. This is a disease that's actually pretty common when you get into the Midwest. We want to look for those brown lesions at the tops and the bottoms of the leaves. Something that's going to come in when we're warm outside. We have some wetter conditions that are out there. In terms of a fungicide application, this is really going to be at at our R1 to our R3 growth stages is where we're going to want to watch this. Another thing on the management side to kind of keep into consideration here is really watching your timings on your irrigation, especially as we move into those reproductive stages. We don't want that plant to have that wet surface so that we bust open those pustules and start to spread that. We want to make sure that we're able to kind of improve our airflow through that canopy. And just as a side note, this is one of those diseases that you'll see into vegetables, especially on the tomato side. So if you're starting to see this in your garden or in some of the vegetable fields around you, a pretty common disease that you'll see into soybeans. And then on the rust side, usually something that we'll see in the south first, and those spores will start to move more into the northern states, but also a pretty common disease. We want to look for those tannish or reddish brown spots that are out there. We want to look for this, especially as we start to get into some really dense canopy scenarios. And then on the fungicide side, what we want to watch for here is watch those weather patterns as we start to get into some high humidity. Something that's over 75 degrees is really, or 75% humidity is really where that foliar disease can start.
And now we are going to talk about insect management. Again, looking at these as you're scouting your fields and how we can spot and manage them. So the first one is two-spotted spider mites. Much of the Midwest is facing some pretty droughty conditions still, so this one is one to be on the lookout for. It is very common in dry conditions and very hot conditions. You'll find infestations start usually around the perimeter and borders of the fields, and they're very small, but they do have, if you look really closely at them, they are very orange color, reddish color with a spot on each side. Infestations can occur rapidly, and when it comes to scouting your fields, if you have about 10 to 15% of your leaves discolored, that's when it is time to take action with an insecticide.
Yeah, the two-spotted spider mite, a great thing to carry with you when you're doing that is either like a white piece of paper, a white paper plate, something that you can knock those leaves onto that plate, and then start to take your magnifying glass, and you can start to do a little bit better counting on there. But if you got that white piece of paper, that white paper plate, that's a really good method to determine what you've got out in that field.
And then we have the bean leaf beetle. These guys can be varying in colors from yellow, orange, red, or tan. And then they also have some spots. Might be 2 spots or might be 4 spots. But what is going to be the distinguishing factor on a bean leaf beetle is going to be that triangle on the back right behind the neck area. So if you are looking for bugs and you see a few different variations of these, just make sure that you're looking for that black triangle to properly identify the bean leaf beetle. When you are looking at damage, you are going to be seeing some defoliation, and they can also feed on pods, and that's where you're going to really see your impact in yield and seed quality. When you're coming to your threshold, if you have about 2 to 10 beetles per plant, that's when it's time to take action with insecticides. So we are going to touch on a few additional resources. If you're looking for more information, we have a blog posted on our website highlighting our soybean foliar diseases. We have a winter white paper, which goes very in-depth over our high yield program and recommendations throughout the season and considerations for your nutrient management throughout the year. We also have the download of the high yield programs, which we talked about today with wheat and soybeans, but we have them for various other crops from corn, organic corn, and specialty crops as well. Those are all available on our website. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to your territory manager, and we appreciate you and thank you very much.